Welcome to Void of Fears, where the line between reality and nightmares blur with every tale. What you're about to hear has happened to someone, somewhere, perhaps even someone just like you. Our community continues to grow, and now we're reaching for 100,000 subscribers. If these glimpses into the unknown call to you, please consider subscribing. Now let's dive into tonight's story. The nightmare began 3 weeks before Dr. Paul Bennett ever set foot on the Sea Falcon. It started with satellite images that shouldn't have existed, electromagnetic readings that defied every known law of physics, and a growing sense that something ancient and malevolent was stirring in the deepest waters of the Atlantic Ocean. Paul stared at the classified documents spread across his desk in the Marine Biology Institute, his coffee growing cold as he studied the impossible data for the 100th time. The satellite imagery showed a perfect circle of distorted water roughly 2 miles in diameter, located at coordinates that made his blood run cold. These were the exact coordinates where Flight 19 had vanished in 1945, where the SS Marine Sulphur Queen had disappeared without a trace in 1963, where dozens of ships and aircraft had simply ceased to exist over the past century. But the disappearances had stopped. Modern GPS systems automatically routed traffic around these coordinates, treating them like a navigational black hole. Pilots reported their instruments failing when they approached the area, compasses spinning wildly, radio equipment broadcasting voices in languages that didn't exist. Most simply avoided the region entirely, following the path of least resistance that technology provided. That avoidance, Paul was beginning to realize, might have been a terrible mistake. The electromagnetic readings were unlike anything in the scientific literature. Dr. Elena Vasquez from the Geophysical Survey Division had called him personally, her voice tight with barely controlled excitement and fear. The energy signatures emanating from the ocean floor suggested something massive, not just large, but operating at power levels that dwarfed nuclear reactors. "Paul, you need to see this data," she had said during their encrypted video call. "Whatever's down there has been dormant for decades, but it's showing increasing activity. The energy readings have tripled in the past 6 months." Paul had spent years studying the Bermuda Triangle phenomenon, approaching it with the skeptical eye of a career scientist. Most of the disappearances had rational explanations: sudden weather changes, human error, mechanical failures. But there remained a core group of cases that defied every conventional explanation, clustered around those specific coordinates like iron filings drawn to a magnet. The funding for this expedition had come through channels that didn't officially exist, approved by agencies whose names were redacted from every document Paul received. Someone with significant power and unlimited resources wanted to know what was happening in those waters, and they were willing to risk everything to find out. Paul had assembled his team with painstaking care. Dr. Becca Walsh was perhaps the most accomplished marine geologist of her generation, with 23 years of experience mapping the ocean floor in places where others feared to venture. Her work had revealed underwater mountain ranges, ancient riverbeds, and geological formations that rewrote textbooks about Earth's history. Mike Torres brought 3 decades of deep sea operations experience, having piloted submersibles into some of the most dangerous waters on the planet. He had descended into the Mariana Trench, explored underwater volcanoes in the Pacific Ring of Fire, and recovered wreckage from depths that few humans had ever reached. If anyone could safely navigate the waters above the triangle coordinates, it was Mike. But as Paul packed his equipment for the expedition, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something far more dangerous than any natural phenomenon. The classified briefings had been filled with references to anomalous readings, temporal distortions, and possible non-terrestrial artifacts. The language was carefully neutral, but Paul could read between the lines. Someone suspected they weren't dealing with anything that had originated on Earth. The Sea Falcon departed from a private marina in Miami 3 days before dawn, slipping away from civilization under cover of darkness. The research vessel was state-of-the-art, equipped with the most advanced sonar systems, underwater robotics, and communication equipment available to civilian researchers. But Paul noticed modifications that hadn't been in the original specifications: additional shielding around the electronics, backup power systems that could operate independently of the main grid, and communication arrays that seemed designed to punch through any kind of interference. The voyage to the coordinates took 18 hours, during which Paul found himself unable to sleep. He stood on the deck watching the ocean change around them as they approached their destination. The water gradually shifted from the normal blue-green of the Atlantic to something darker, more opaque, as if light itself was reluctant to penetrate these depths. By the time they reached the coordinates, even the most skeptical members of the crew were beginning to understand that they had entered something beyond normal maritime experience. The ocean here moved differently, with currents that flowed in directions that made no sense according to their charts. Waves formed and dissipated in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if something beneath the surface was orchestrating the movement of water itself. "Take a look at this," Captain Rodriguez called from the bridge, his voice tight with confusion. He was a 20-year veteran of research vessel operations, a man who had weathered hurricanes and navigated through pack ice without losing his composure. But now his hands shook slightly as he pointed to the navigation displays. Paul climbed to the bridge and immediately understood the captain's concern. Their GPS readings were fluctuating wildly, showing their position jumping by miles from second to second. The compass spun lazily in its housing, never settling on any particular direction. Most disturbing of all, their radio was picking up transmissions that shouldn't exist. Conversations in English, Spanish, and other languages, but with an underlying distortion that made them sound as if they were coming from underwater. "How long have we been receiving those signals?" Paul asked, listening to what sounded like a pilot's voice reporting his position, followed by static, then silence. "Started about an hour ago," Rodriguez replied. "But here's the thing. Some of those transmissions are using call signs from aircraft that disappeared decades ago. I looked it up. That pilot we just heard, his plane went missing in 1978. Paul felt a chill run down his spine. Time seemed to behave differently here, as if past and present existed simultaneously in these waters. He thought about the classified briefings, the references to temporal distortions, and began to understand why this expedition had been organized at such a high level of secrecy. Dr. Becca Walsh emerged from the ship's laboratory, carrying her laptop and a collection of geological surveys that looked more like abstract art than scientific data. Her weathered hands, marked by years of handling rock samples and deep-sea equipment, trembled slightly as she showed Paul the readings they were getting from the ocean floor. "These sonar signatures don't make sense," she said, setting her laptop on the chart table. "The seafloor topology suggests something massive down there, but the density readings are completely inconsistent. It's like whatever's on the bottom is both incredibly solid and somehow hollow at the same time." Paul studied the displays, his marine biology training struggling to process what he was seeing. The sonar was detecting structures that appeared to be geometric rather than natural, extending across the ocean floor in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. But the formations were enormous, far larger than anything humans could have constructed, even with modern technology. "The electromagnetic readings are even stranger," Becca continued, pulling up another set of data. "There's a consistent energy signature coming from the structures, operating at frequencies I've never encountered before. It's almost like they're powered by some kind of technology that doesn't exist in our physics textbooks." Mike Torres joined them on the bridge, carrying a steaming mug of coffee and wearing the expression of a man who had seen too much in his 30 years of deep-sea operations. His lined face bore the permanent squint of someone who had spent decades staring into the abyss, and his hands showed the steady competence of a pilot who had never lost a submersible or crew member. "Deep Hunter's prepped and ready for descent," he announced, then paused, studying the data on Becca's laptop. "But I gotta tell you folks, something's not right about this place. Been diving all over the world, and I've never felt anything like what's happening here." "What do you mean?" Paul asked, though he already suspected he knew. They all felt it, the wrongness that seemed to emanate from the water itself, a sense that they had crossed some invisible boundary into a realm where the normal rules of reality no longer applied. Mike set down his mug and walked to the nearest window, gesturing towards the ocean surrounding them. "Look at the water. Really look at it." Paul and Becca joined him at the observation window. At first glance, the ocean appeared normal. Deep blue water stretching to the horizon under an overcast sky. But as Paul focused his attention, he began to see what Mike meant. The water moved with an unnatural rhythm, waves forming and dissipating in geometric patterns that seemed to follow some incomprehensible logic. "It's like the ocean itself is breathing," Mike said quietly. "Like there's something massive underneath us, and we're feeling its respiration." Paul had spent his entire career studying marine ecosystems, developing an almost supernatural ability to read the ocean's moods and understand the complex interactions between water, weather, and marine life. But here, that intuitive understanding failed him completely. The water around the Sea Falcon felt alien, as if they had somehow sailed beyond the boundaries of the natural world into something that operated by entirely different principles. "The marine life is gone too," Becca observed, pointing to the sonar displays that should have shown schools of fish, squid, and other deep-sea creatures. "According to our biological surveys, this area should be teeming with life. The water temperature, salinity, and nutrient levels are perfect for supporting a complex ecosystem, but the sonar isn't picking up anything larger than microscopic plankton." Paul felt his scientific mind struggling to process the implications. Marine ecosystems didn't just disappear without cause. Even the most polluted waters supported some form of life, and these waters showed no signs of contamination or environmental damage. It was as if every living creature had simply chosen to avoid this area, following some instinct that warned them away from whatever waited in the depths below. They spent the next 2 hours reviewing their equipment and mission parameters. The plan was straightforward in concept, but terrifying in execution. Take the Deep Hunter submersible down to investigate the anomalous readings, document whatever they found, and surface with evidence that would either revolutionize human understanding of the ocean or confirm their worst fears about what lurked beneath the Bermuda Triangle. The Deep Hunter was a marvel of engineering, a state-of-the-art submersible capable of withstanding pressures that would crush a human body instantly. Its titanium hull was designed to protect 3 occupants at depths exceeding 15,000 feet, equipped with the most advanced life support systems, communication equipment, and scientific instruments available to civilian researchers. But Paul noticed modifications that hadn't been in the original specifications. The hull showed signs of additional reinforcement, electromagnetic shielding that seemed designed to protect against interference far beyond normal operational parameters. The communication systems included backup arrays that could apparently operate independently of conventional radio frequencies, and the life support systems had been upgraded with emergency protocols that suggested the possibility of extended isolation. "Someone's expecting us to encounter things that conventional equipment can't handle," Paul observed, running his hands along the reinforced hull sections. "Or they're expecting us to be down there a lot longer than the mission parameters suggest," Mike replied grimly. He had been studying the submersible's systems with the eye of someone who understood that his life would depend on every circuit and mechanical component functioning perfectly under impossible conditions. By noon they were suited up and ready for descent. Paul squeezed into the passenger compartment alongside Becca, their scientific equipment packed into every available space. Mike settled into the pilot's seat with the practiced ease of someone who had made this journey hundreds of times before, but Paul could see the tension in his shoulders as he performed the final systems checks. "All systems green," Mike announced over the intercom. "Beginning descent in 30 seconds. Once we cross 1,000 feet, we'll be committed to this dive. Last chance for anyone to change their minds." Paul looked at Becca, seeing his own mixture of terror and scientific curiosity reflected in her eyes. They had spent years preparing for this moment, assembling evidence and building theories about what might be waiting in the depths below. But theories were different from reality, and reality was about to test every assumption they had made about the nature of the universe itself. "Take us down," Paul said, his voice steadier than he felt. The moment they left the surface, Paul knew they had crossed some invisible threshold, into a realm where the normal laws of physics no longer applied. The water around them seemed to thicken, taking on an almost syrupy quality that made their descent feel sluggish despite the submersible's powerful ballast systems. "Passing 200 feet, Mike reported, his voice steady, but edged with growing concern. "Water temperature is dropping faster than normal. We should be at 72 degrees at this depth, but I'm reading 58 and falling." Outside the reinforced portholes, the usual parade of marine life was conspicuously absent. Paul pressed his face against the thick glass, searching for any sign of the fish, jellyfish, and other creatures that should have been abundant at this depth. Instead, he saw only empty water that seemed to grow darker with each passing moment, as if light itself was being absorbed by something in the depths below. 500 feet, Mike called out. Still no marine life on sonar, and the water temperature has dropped to 45 degrees. This is completely outside normal parameters for this region. Becca was studying her instruments with growing alarm. The water chemistry is changing too. Salinity levels are fluctuating wildly, and I'm detecting trace elements that shouldn't exist at these concentrations. Some of these readings suggest the presence of heavy metals and rare earth elements that would require extreme geological processes to concentrate. At 800 feet, they encountered their first truly inexplicable phenomenon. The submersible's exterior lights illuminated what appeared to be a layer of water that moved independently of the surrounding ocean. It flowed in perfectly geometric patterns, forming spirals and helixes that maintained their shape despite the surrounding currents. "Are you seeing this?" Paul whispered, pressing his face today against the porthole. The geometric water formations stretched as far as their lights could penetrate, creating an underwater aurora that pulsed with its own internal rhythm. "I'm seeing it, but I don't believe it," Mike replied, his voice tight with tension. "Water doesn't behave like this. It's like it's following some kind of programming, organizing itself according to rules that don't exist in fluid dynamics." They passed through the strange layer at 900 feet, and immediately their instruments began registering impossible readings. The pressure gauges fluctuated wildly, showing readings that varied by thousands of pounds per square inch from moment to moment. The temperature sensors couldn't seem to settle on any consistent measurement, jumping between readings that ranged from near freezing to uncomfortably warm. "Our equipment must be malfunctioning," Becca said, but her voice lacked conviction. They all knew their instruments were functioning perfectly. They were simply encountering phenomena that defied measurement by conventional means, operating in an environment where the basic assumptions of physics were apparently negotiable. At 1,200 feet, they began to hear the voices. It started as static on their communication system, faint whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. But gradually the sounds resolved into what were unmistakably human voices, speaking in languages Paul didn't recognize but somehow understood, at a level that bypassed conscious thought. "Mike, are you picking up any radio signals?" Paul asked, though he already knew the answer. They were too deep for conventional radio transmission, and their equipment wasn't designed to receive signals from external sources during descent. Nothing on any frequency we monitor, Mike replied, his knuckles white as he gripped the controls. But those voices are getting stronger, and they're not coming through our radio system. They're coming through the water itself. The whispers grew more distinct as they descended, and Paul began to make out individual words, though in no language he had ever encountered. The syllables seemed to twist in his mind, carrying meanings that bypassed his conscious understanding and spoke directly to some deeper, more primitive part of his brain. He found himself understanding fragments of conversations that seemed to be taking place across vast distances of time and space. At 1,800 feet, the voices became clear enough to distinguish individual speakers. Paul heard what sounded like pilots reporting their positions, sailors calling for help, passengers screaming in terror, but the voices were layered, overlapping, as if dozens of different conversations were happening simultaneously in the same space. "Those are distress calls," Becca said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some of them are in English, but the accents, they sound like they're from different time periods." Paul listened more carefully, trying to isolate individual voices from the chaotic chorus. He heard a pilot using terminology and call signs that hadn't been standard since the 1940s, followed by a sailor speaking in what sounded like Spanish from an earlier century. The voices weren't recordings, they had the quality of live transmissions, as if the speakers were somehow still present in this space, trapped in an eternal moment of their final communications. At 2,500 feet, they encountered something that made Paul question his own sanity. The water around them began to glow with a phosphorescent light that seemed to respond to their presence. As they descended, the glow intensified, creating patterns that looked almost like writing, symbols and characters that shifted and changed when viewed directly but seemed meaningful when glimpsed peripherally. "The bioluminescence doesn't match any known marine organism," Becca observed, studying her biological sensors. "The light spectrum is wrong for natural phosphorescence, and the patterns are too complex to be random. It's almost like the water itself is trying to communicate with us." Mike was studying his navigation instruments with growing confusion. "Our depth readings are becoming unreliable. The sonar says we're at 2,800 feet, but the pressure readings suggest we're much deeper. It's like the normal relationship between depth and pressure is broken down." At 3,000 feet, they encountered a phenomenon that defied every principle of underwater physics. The water around them began to exhibit properties that seemed more like a gas than a liquid. Their descent slowed dramatically, as if they were moving through a medium that was simultaneously more and less dense than normal seawater. "This is impossible," Becca muttered, checking and rechecking her instruments. "Water can't behave like this. The molecular structure would have to be completely altered, but our chemical sensors aren't detecting any change in composition." Paul watched in fascination as small objects, debris from the surface, bits of organic matter, moved through the water in ways that violated basic physics. Some items fell normally, while others drifted horizontally or even upward, as if gravity itself was operating by different rules in this region. The voices were becoming overwhelming now, a cacophony of human desperation, spanning decades or perhaps centuries. Paul heard fragments of conversations in English, Spanish, German, and languages he couldn't identify. But underneath the human voices, he began to detect something else, a deeper sound that wasn't quite a voice, wasn't quite music, but carried a sense of vast intelligence and malevolent purpose. At 4,000 feet, their sonar finally detected something solid below them. But the readings were so massive that Becca initially assumed the equipment was malfunctioning. The sonar signature extended beyond their maximum detection range, suggesting something that covered the entire ocean floor in this region. "Contact confirmed," Mike announced, his voice barely steady. "The object is... I can't even estimate the size. The sonar signature extends to the limits of our detection range, and the density readings are completely inconsistent with any known material. Paul felt his heart hammering against his ribs as they approached what the sonar was telling them should be the bottom, but instead of the familiar sight of the ocean floor, they encountered something that challenged every assumption he had made about the nature of reality itself. A colossal structure emerged from the darkness below them, like a cathedral built by gods. The edifice stretched across the seafloor for what must have been miles in every direction, its spires and buttresses reaching upward through the crushing depths with impossible grace. The architecture was unlike anything in human history, not quite geometric, not quite organic, but something that existed in the spaces between those concepts. "My God," Becca whispered, her geological training failing to provide any framework for what they were witnessing. "How old is this thing? And how has it survived the pressure at this depth?" The structure appeared to be carved from a single piece of black stone, but as their lights played across its surface, Paul realized it wasn't stone at all. The material seemed to shift and flow like liquid while maintaining perfect structural integrity. It was warm to the touch of their sonar beams, generating its own heat signature, despite being thousands of feet underwater. Spiraling channels covered every surface of the structure, pulsing with a phosphorescent glow that moved through the edifice like a circulatory system carrying liquid light. The patterns were hypnotic, drawing the eye into spirals that seemed to extend infinitely inward, creating optical illusions that made Paul's vision blur and his head spin. "Those channels aren't decorative," Paul observed, fighting against the disorientation caused by staring at the patterns. "They're functional. The phosphorescence is flowing through them like blood through arteries, but I have no idea what purpose it serves." Mike guided the deep hunter closer to the structure, and immediately their instruments went completely haywire. The compass spun wildly, never settling on any particular direction. Their radio filled with static so intense it sounded like screaming, but underneath the white noise the human voices became clearer and more distinct. Paul could now make out individual conversations, fragments of final transmissions from people who had vanished in this region over the decades. A pilot reporting instrument failure, his voice calm and professional even as his aircraft was apparently being pulled into the depths. A ship's captain calling Mayday, describing impossible weather conditions, and equipment failures that made no scientific sense. But most disturbing were the voices that seemed to be responding to each other across vast gaps in time. Paul heard what sounded like a conversation between a pilot from the 1940s and a sailor from the 1980s, as if they were somehow occupying the same space despite being separated by decades. The surface of the structure was covered in intricate carvings that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. The symbols were painful to look at, creating a sensation like trying to focus on something that existed in too many dimensions for human perception to process. But in his peripheral vision, Paul could see that the carvings told a story. Scenes of figures that might have been human, engaged in activities that seemed to involve ritual and sacrifice. "There," Becca pointed to a section of the structure where the carvings formed what appeared to be an archway. "That looks like an entrance, but it's massive, easily large enough for a submarine to pass through." The opening was framed by symbols that glowed brighter than the rest, pulsing in rhythm with the phosphorescent channels that covered the entire structure. As they approached, the symbols began to change, rearranging themselves into new configurations that somehow conveyed a sense of invitation and warning simultaneously. "I don't like this," Mike said, his hands hesitating on the controls. "Every instinct I've developed in 30 years of diving is telling me to surface right now and never come back. This place feels hungry." "But think about what this means," Paul argued, his scientific curiosity overriding his fear. "This structure predates any known civilization by thousands, maybe millions of years. We could be looking at proof that advanced intelligence, existed on Earth long before humans evolved. Or we could be looking at something that was never from Earth at all, Becca finished quietly, studying the alien geometry of the carvings. Despite Mike's reservations, they entered the structure through the archway. The moment they crossed the threshold, Paul felt something fundamental change in the water around them. The pressure readings on their instruments became stable for the first time since beginning their descent, settling at levels that were impossibly low for their depth. The sensation was like passing through a membrane between two different realities. On one side was the normal ocean, governed by the familiar laws of physics and chemistry. On the other side was something else entirely, a space where those laws were apparently optional and reality operated according to principles that human science had never discovered. They found themselves in a tunnel that defied every law of underwater architecture Paul had ever learned. The walls glowed with the same phosphorescent substance that covered the exterior, but here the light was brighter, more purposeful. The tunnel was perfectly round and large enough for a nuclear submarine to pass through comfortably, yet the water pressure remained constant, despite the enormous open space. "This is impossible," Becca muttered, checking and rechecking her instruments. "We're 4,000 feet underwater. Any hollow space this large should have been crushed by the pressure millions of years ago. The structural engineering required to maintain this kind of open space at this depth is beyond anything humans have ever achieved." The tunnel led them deeper into the structure, branching and converging in patterns that seemed to follow some incomprehensible logic. Paul noticed that the whispered voices were stronger here, and he was beginning to distinguish not just individual conversations, but entire narratives, stories of exploration and discovery that had ended in terror and disappearance. He heard the final log entry of a research vessel that had vanished in 1987, the captain describing impossible sights and equipment failures that exactly matched what they were experiencing. But the recording didn't end with the ship's destruction. It continued, the captain's voice growing distant and strange as he described being taken somewhere beneath the ocean to a place where time moved differently and the normal rules of existence no longer applied. The tunnel system was vast, extending through the structure like the circulatory system of some enormous organism. They passed junctions where other tunnels branched off into darkness, some leading upward towards chambers they couldn't see, others descending into depths that their lights couldn't penetrate. "It's like a city," Becca observed, studying the tunnel network on their sonar displays, "but a city designed for something much larger than humans. The scale is enormous." They emerged from the tunnel system into a vast chamber that took Paul's breath away. The space was so large that their lights couldn't illuminate the far walls, stretching away into darkness that seemed to swallow illumination itself. The ceiling disappeared into shadows above them, supported by pillars that looked more grown than constructed. But what truly shocked Paul was what Becca's instruments were telling them about the chamber's atmosphere. "There's air in here," she announced, her voice filled with disbelief. "Breathable atmosphere. At normal pressure, 4,000 feet underwater. According to these readings, we could open the hatch and walk around." Mike stared at his depth readings, which had become completely unreliable since entering the structure. Either our instruments are completely fried, or we're inside something that operates by rules that don't exist in our physics textbooks. Paul studied the chamber walls, which were covered in murals that made the exterior carvings look simple by comparison. The artwork depicted scenes of an underwater civilization that seemed to exist on a scale that dwarfed human achievement. The beings shown in the murals appeared almost human, but with subtle differences that marked them as something else entirely. They had elongated limbs that seemed designed for life underwater, larger eyes that would have been adapted for the darkness of the deep ocean, and what appeared to be gills along their necks. But their posture and expressions conveyed intelligence and sophistication that suggested a civilization far more advanced than anything humans had achieved. "Look at this sequence," Paul said, pointing to a series of panels that seemed to tell a coherent story. These beings weren't just living underwater, they were engineering it, shaping it according to their will. The murals showed the underwater beings as masters of their environment, capable of manipulating water pressure, ocean currents, and marine life itself. They appeared to be gardeners of the sea, cultivating species and ecosystems according to designs that combined science with art. Some panels showed them working with creatures Paul didn't recognize from any catalogue of marine biology, organisms that seemed to be part plant, part animal, and part something else entirely. But as the mural sequence progressed, the tone changed dramatically. The beings were shown in states of increasing agitation, pointing towards something in the deeper parts of their city. The artwork became more abstract, more disturbing, depicting scenes of conflict and terror that seemed to involve entities that existed partially outside normal space and time. The final panels showed the underwater beings fleeing upward, abandoning their magnificent city in apparent terror. But they weren't just running. They were working frantically on some massive project, installing machinery and creating barriers that suggested they were trying to contain something rather than simply escape from it. They were trying to build a prison, Paul realized, studying the desperate activity captured in the carvings. They weren't fleeing, they were making a last stand. Mike had been exploring the chamber's perimeter and discovered something that changed their understanding of their situation entirely. "Folks, you need to see this. We can actually surface here." Paul and Becca joined him at what appeared to be a natural pool in the chamber floor. Mike's instruments indicated that the water here was only a few feet deep, opening into a massive air pocket above. It was impossible according to every principle of underwater physics, but then everything about this place defied possibility. "I'm taking us up," Mike announced, and before anyone could object, he activated the ballast systems. The deep hunter rose through the impossibly shallow water and broke the surface into breathable air that shouldn't have existed. They sat in stunned silence for a moment, listening to the gentle lapping of water against their hull. The air outside smelled different from anything Paul had ever experienced. Cleaner somehow, with an ozone freshness that reminded him of the moments after a lightning strike, but with underlying notes that seemed to come from somewhere outside Earth's normal chemical processes. "I'm opening the hatch," Mike said, and Paul didn't try to stop him. They were far beyond normal safety protocols now, operating in a realm where conventional wisdom had no meaning. The moment the hatch opened, Paul knew they had crossed into a space where the normal rules of reality were at best guidelines rather than laws. The air was not only breathable, but somehow invigorating, filling his lungs with an energy he had never experienced. Each breath seemed to carry more oxygen than should have been possible, leaving him feeling almost euphoric despite the terror of their situation. They climbed out onto a platform that appeared to be made of the same flowing stone as the rest of the structure. The surface was warm beneath their feet and seemed to pulse gently with its own heartbeat. Ancient machinery lined the chamber walls, still humming with power after countless ages, covered in the same shifting symbols they had seen throughout the structure. "How is any of this still functioning?" Becca wondered aloud, approaching one of the control panels. The surface was covered in symbols that seemed to respond to her presence, glowing brighter as she drew near. Paul was drawn to a series of murals that covered the chamber's far wall. These were different from the ones they had seen in the tunnels, more recent somehow, though still incredibly ancient. They showed the underwater beings in their final period, working frantically on the massive machinery that surrounded them. The images depicted a civilization making its last desperate gamble against something that threatened not just their existence, but the very fabric of reality itself. They were building something, Not just a prison, but a complex system designed to contain and monitor whatever they had discovered in the deepest parts of their world. They weren't just trying to escape, Paul realized. Studying the frantic activity captured in the carvings, they were creating a warning system, a way to monitor whatever they were trying to contain. The murals showed the beings installing the machinery that still hummed around them, creating what appeared to be some kind of monitoring system designed to detect and respond to threats that existed outside normal space and time. But the final panels showed them making an even greater sacrifice, merging themselves with their creation, becoming part of the monitoring system to ensure it would never fail. Mike had found another control panel and was studying it with the practical eye of someone who had spent his life working with complex machinery. These controls look functional. The symbols change when I get close, like they're responding to my bioelectric field or something. Don't touch anything, Becca warned, but Paul was already approaching another panel, drawn by an inexplicable compulsion that seemed to come from outside his own consciousness. The symbols on the surface began to glow brighter as he approached, rearranging themselves into patterns that somehow conveyed meaning, despite being unlike any writing system he had ever encountered. The moment his fingers made contact with the smooth surface, the entire chamber exploded into activity that was both beautiful and terrifying. Holographic displays materialized in the air around them, showing three-dimensional views of the ocean above, and something else. Something moving through chambers far deeper than their current position. The images were incredibly detailed, giving them perspectives of the structure they could never have achieved from their submersible. But it was what the displays revealed about the deeper levels that made Paul's blood turn to ice in his veins. The structure extended far deeper than they had imagined. Not just a building, but an entire complex that burrowed into the ocean floor for miles. The deeper chambers were filled with machinery that operated on principles Paul couldn't begin to understand, creating fields and barriers that seemed to exist in more dimensions than human perception could process. And in the deepest chambers, something was moving, something vast and wrong that seemed to exist partially outside the normal boundaries of space and time, pressing against barriers that had contained it for millennia, but were clearly beginning to weaken. "Paul, step away from that control panel," Mike said urgently. But Paul couldn't move. The displays were showing him things he needed to understand. Terrible truths about the nature of this place and what it had been built to contain. The holograms revealed the real history of the underwater civilization, told in images that bypassed language and spoke directly to his understanding. They had been peaceful, advanced beyond human comprehension, living in harmony with the ocean for millions of years. Their technology was based on principles that combined science with what humans would call magic, allowing them to manipulate matter and energy at the quantum level. But something had come from the deepest trenches of space and time, not just the ocean, but the fundamental structure of reality itself. It was an entity that existed in the spaces between dimensions, feeding on consciousness and intelligence wherever it found them. The creature wasn't simply a predator in any conventional sense. It was something that consumed the very essence of intelligent thought, absorbing minds and incorporating them into its own ever-growing consciousness. It didn't just kill its victims, it preserved them in eternal awareness, using their knowledge and memories as tools for finding and consuming other sources of intelligence. Paul watched in horror as the displays showed the entity's assault on the underwater civilization. It had started slowly, taking isolated individuals from remote settlements, but as it fed, it grew stronger and more sophisticated, eventually learning to mimic its victims perfectly. Entire cities fell from within as the creature absorbed their populations, using their own knowledge and technology against their former companions. The underwater beings had fought back with weapons that manipulated reality itself, riping holes in space-time and creating barriers that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. But even their advanced technology couldn't destroy something that existed partially outside the normal universe. The entity simply adapted, learning from each attack, and becoming stronger with every mind it consumed. "This is what they were trying to contain," Paul said, his voice barely audible, as he watched the holographic displays show the entity's true nature. Not just a creature, but something that threatens the fundamental nature of consciousness itself. The displays showed the underwater being's final strategy, not destruction, which was impossible, but containment. They had built this prison using technology that drew its power from the life, force, and consciousness of its operators. The structure itself was alive in a sense, powered by the merged consciousness of the civilization's greatest minds. But the prison required constant maintenance, constant vigilance. The barriers had to be monitored and reinforced regularly, and the entity had to be fed just enough to keep it docile without allowing it to grow stronger. The underwater beings had accepted this terrible responsibility, knowing that failure would mean not just their own extinction, but the eventual consumption of all intelligent life in the universe. The final guardians had made the ultimate sacrifice, merging their consciousness with the prison's quantum matrix to create an eternal watch over the creature below. But Paul could see from the displays that the system was failing. After countless millennia, the barriers were weakening, and the merged consciousness of the original guardians was beginning to fade. "We need to leave," Becca said urgently, backing away from the displays as their true implications became clear. "We need to leave right now and make sure no one ever comes back to this place." But as Paul continued to interact with the control systems, trying to understand the full extent of what they had discovered, he triggered something he hadn't intended. Warning lights began flashing throughout the chamber, bathing everything in an ominous red glow. An alarm began to sound, not through any speakers they could see, but emanating from the structure itself, vibrating through the stone and water around them. Deep beneath them, something stirred for the first time in geological ages. The structure began to vibrate, subtle at first but growing stronger with each passing moment. The phosphorescent channels that covered the walls pulsed faster, their rhythm becoming frantic as energy coursed through systems that had been dormant for millennia. Through transparent sections of the floor, they could see movement in the darkness far below, something colossal and segmented, like a cosmic worm made of living shadow and malevolent intelligence. "What have you done?" Mike shouted over the increasing noise, but Paul was transfixed by what the displays were showing him. The entity was waking up, and its attention was focused directly on them. The creature had been dormant, sustained by the slow trickle of consciousness provided by the failing Guardian system. But their presence, 3 new minds full of fear and wonder, had provided it with the first substantial feeding it had received in decades. It was using that energy to test the barriers that had contained it for so long. As the entity stirred, Paul began to hear voices more clearly than ever before. But these weren't the whispered conversations they had been hearing during their descent. These were screams of terror and despair, the final moments of everyone the creature had ever consumed, preserved forever within its consciousness like insects trapped in amber. The voices came in waves, overlapping and interweaving in a symphony of suffering that spanned not just decades but centuries. Paul heard the pilots of Flight 19, their voices clear and desperate as they described instruments failing and reality warping around them. He heard the passengers and crew of ships that had vanished in the Triangle over the past century, their last moments of terror echoing across time. But among the more recent voices, Paul began to recognize something far older and more disturbing. He heard the voices of the original Guardians themselves, the underwater beings who had sacrificed themselves to create this prison. They were still conscious, still aware, after millions of years, trapped within the entity's collective mind. and experiencing eternal torment. "It doesn't just kill," Paul said, his voice filled with horror as he understood the true nature of what they were facing. "It preserves everything. Every mind it's ever consumed is still alive inside it, still suffering." Becca had found additional carvings that had been revealed when the warning systems activated. The symbols told the final story of the prison's construction, showing in graphic detail how the entity consumed consciousness. It didn't simply absorb memories or knowledge, it trapped the entire essence of its victims within its own mental matrix, using their suffering as a source of power while forcing them to experience every moment of agony for eternity. The carvings showed victims from dozens of different worlds, all trapped within the creature's consciousness. The entity was not native to Earth. It was something that traveled between dimensions, seeking out planets with intelligent life and consuming entire civilizations before moving on to the next target. Earth had been its most challenging conquest, thanks to the intervention of the underwater civilization. But they had only managed to delay the inevitable, trapping the creature in a prison that was never meant to be permanent. The entity had been patient, using its vast intelligence to slowly work at the barriers, while feeding on whatever consciousness it could obtain. The disappearances in the Bermuda Triangle had been its feeding schedule, carefully timed extractions designed to provide just enough mental energy to sustain it while it worked to escape. But the increasing sophistication of human navigation technology had reduced the number of victims, leaving the entity hungry and desperate. Their arrival had been a gift beyond the creature's wildest dreams. 3 highly educated minds filled with scientific knowledge and burning curiosity. The entity had been feeding on their thoughts and emotions since the moment they entered the structure, growing stronger with each revelation of horror. "It's been planning this," Paul realized, watching the displays show the entity's true intelligence at work. Every ship and plane that disappeared wasn't random. It was studying us, learning about human technology and psychology. It's been preparing for the day when it could break free. The entity began to rise through the structure's lower levels, its massive form causing the entire complex to shake. The barriers that had contained it for so long were failing, weakened by millennia of slow decay, and the sudden influx of energy provided by their presence. As it climbed toward them, Paul could feel its consciousness pressing against his mind, trying to establish the connection that would allow it to begin the absorption process. The sensation was unlike anything he had ever experienced, a cold, alien intelligence that was vast beyond comprehension, but fundamentally hostile to everything that made him human. Through the entity's attempted mental contact, Paul caught glimpses of its true nature and history. It was old beyond measure, having existed since the early days of the universe itself. It had consumed countless civilizations across the galaxy, growing stronger and more sophisticated with each conquest. But it wasn't just seeking to feed. It had a larger purpose. The entity was working toward becoming a godlike intelligence that would incorporate the consciousness of every sentient being in the universe. It saw itself as bringing order to the chaos of individual thought, creating a unified mental network with itself at the center. The displays showed the creature's ultimate goal: to escape this prison and begin the systematic conquest of human civilization. It would start slowly, as it always did, taking isolated individuals and learning their knowledge and capabilities, but eventually it would begin consuming entire populations, using their combined intelligence to develop technology that would allow it to reach other worlds. "We have to stop it," Paul said desperately, working frantically at the control panels. "There has to be a way to reinforce the prison, to strengthen the barriers." But as he explored the ancient systems, Paul discovered the terrible truth about how the containment protocol actually worked. The prison couldn't be maintained through technology alone. It required a living consciousness to operate the quantum barriers manually. Someone had to merge with the prison systems, becoming a permanent guardian like those who had come before. The original underwater beings had accepted this responsibility willingly, understanding that the sacrifice of the few was necessary to protect the many, but their merged consciousness was fading after millions of years of constant vigilance, and the entity was using that weakness to slowly corrode the barriers that contained it. The control panels showed Paul exactly what needed to be done. Someone had to take the place of the failing guardians, merging their consciousness with the prison's quantum matrix to create a new seal. But the process was irreversible. Whoever made that choice would become part of the structure itself. Their individual identity dissolved into the larger purpose of maintaining the containment. "There has to be another way," Becca said, reading the implications in Paul's expression. "Some kind of technology we can use, some way to reinforce the barriers without sacrificing someone," Paul finished quietly. "I've been through every system, every protocol. This is how it was designed. The barriers require a conscious will to maintain them, someone who chooses to stand guard against what's trapped below." The entity broke through another containment level, its form now partially visible through the chamber's transparent floor sections. Paul could see the faces of its victims swirling within its mass, not just human faces, but the features of beings from dozens of different worlds, all trapped in expressions of eternal anguish. The creature's form defied comprehension in ways that went beyond mere size. It appeared as a massive worm-like entity, but Paul could see that this was just how his human brain interpreted something that existed in more dimensions than he could perceive. The entity's true form extended through layers of reality that his mind couldn't process, making it effectively immortal and nearly impossible to destroy. But it was the intelligence behind that alien form that truly terrified him. The entity wasn't just a mindless predator, it was a cosmic-level intellect that had been planning this escape for millennia. It had studied every aspect of the prison's construction, learning from the consciousness of the beings it had absorbed, waiting for the perfect moment to break free. "It's not just going to escape," Paul said, watching the displays show the entity's true capabilities. "It's going to use everything it learned from us to accelerate its conquest of Earth. Our technology, our psychology, our weaknesses, it knows all of it now." The creature's consciousness pressed harder against Paul's mind, and he caught glimpses of its plans for humanity. It would start with isolated researchers and government officials, people whose disappearance would be noticed, but not immediately connected. It would use their knowledge to understand human society and technology, then begin a systematic infiltration that would be invisible until it was too late. Unlike its conquest of the underwater civilization, which had taken centuries, the entity planned to consume human consciousness within decades. It had learned from its previous experiences, developing more efficient methods of absorption and mental processing. Humanity's global communication networks would actually make the process easier, allowing the entity to spread its influence instantly across the planet. Mike was trying desperately to restart the submersible, but the entity's presence was interfering with all their equipment. Their instruments had become completely unreliable, showing readings that fluctuated wildly or simply displayed impossible values. The creature's alien consciousness was reaching out through the structure's systems, learning to manipulate human technology with terrifying speed. "The engines aren't responding," Mike reported, his voice tight with panic. "Everything's dead. We're trapped here." Paul looked at his friends, then at the control panel that showed him exactly what needed to be done. The choice was becoming clear, even if it was impossible to accept. He could send Becca and Mike back to the surface while he remained to become the new guardian. The ancient systems would merge his consciousness with the prison's quantum matrix, but he would retain enough of himself to keep the entity contained. But the entity seemed to sense his intention and began broadcasting emotions directly into their minds. overwhelming fear, crushing despair, and a sense of inevitable doom that made rational thought almost impossible. It was trying to prevent them from taking action, using psychological warfare to paralyze them with terror. "Don't listen to it," Paul said, fighting against the waves of alien emotion, washing over his consciousness. "It's trying to stop us from doing what needs to be done." The creature began to show them visions of what would happen if they tried to reinforce the prison. It projected images of their deaths, not quick, merciful ends, but slow absorption into its consciousness, their minds trapped forever in the collective suffering of its victims. It wanted them to understand that resistance was futile, that their only choice was between quick death and eternal torment. But Paul could see through the entity's psychological manipulation to the truth underneath. It was afraid, not of death, which was impossible for something like it, but of continued imprisonment. The creature had tasted freedom for the first time in millennia, and the thought of being trapped again for potentially millions more years was driving it to desperation. "It's bluffing," Paul realized, studying the entity's behavior through the displays. "It doesn't want to absorb us if it can help it. Our consciousness would strengthen the prison from within, making escape even more difficult." The truth became clear as Paul continued to analyze the situation. The entity needed them to flee, to carry their terror and knowledge back to the surface world. It wanted humanity to learn about the prison's existence and send more expeditions, more minds to feed on, and more opportunities to manipulate human technology and psychology. But if they stayed and merged with the prison systems, their consciousness would become part of the barrier that contained it. The entity would be trading its chance at immediate escape for potentially millions, more years of imprisonment. "That's why it's showing us these visions," Paul said, understanding the creature's strategy. "It wants us terrified enough to run, but not brave enough to sacrifice ourselves." The entity seemed to realize that its psychological manipulation was failing and shifted tactics. It began to offer them bargains, knowledge in exchange for freedom, technology that would revolutionize human civilization if they would simply leave and allow it to escape. It showed them visions of medical advances that could cure every disease, energy sources that would end scarcity, space travel technology that would allow humanity to spread across the galaxy. But Paul could see the lies woven through these tempting offers. The entity had no intention of sharing knowledge. It was simply trying to delay their decision until it could complete its escape. Every moment they hesitated was another moment. It could work at the weakening barriers. "Get back to Deep Hunter," Paul ordered, moving toward the main control interface. "I'll hold it here as long as I can." "We're not leaving you," Becca protested, but Paul was already activating the emergency protocols. The chamber's exits began to seal themselves, except for the passage leading back to their submersible. "There's no other choice," Paul said, his voice steady despite the terror coursing through his veins. "If this thing escapes, it won't just kill humanity. It'll turn us into something worse than death. At least this way, our sacrifice means something." As his friends reluctantly fled toward their only means of escape, Paul placed his hands on the master control interface. The ancient machinery recognized his intent, and he felt the system beginning to analyze his consciousness, preparing to merge it with the prison's quantum matrix. The process was unlike anything he could have imagined, more profound and terrifying than anything in human experience. Paul felt his individual identity beginning to dissolve as his awareness expanded throughout the entire structure. His mind stretched to encompass every chamber, every corridor, every hidden passage in the vast complex. But the expansion wasn't just physical, it was dimensional. Paul found his consciousness spreading through layers of reality he hadn't known existed, perceiving the universe from perspectives that no human mind was meant to comprehend. He could see the entity not just as it appeared in three-dimensional space, but as it truly was, a multi-dimensional horror that existed across multiple planes of reality simultaneously. The creature sensed the change immediately and turned its full attention toward Paul, trying to absorb his mind before the merging process could complete. It attacked not just his consciousness, but his very sense of self, trying to convince him that he was already part of its collective, that his individual identity was an illusion that could be discarded. But the prison systems protected him, creating quantum barriers between his expanding consciousness and the entity's ravenous appetite. Paul felt himself becoming something more and less than human. His awareness encompassed the entire structure and beyond, but in doing so, he lost much of what had made him who he was. Memories of his life above began to fade, not destroyed but transformed into something larger. His love for Becca and Mike became a more generalized protective instinct toward all conscious life. His scientific curiosity expanded into a cosmic understanding of the fundamental nature of reality. His human fears and desires were absorbed into the greater purpose of his new existence. Paul became the new guardian, his consciousness merging with the ancient systems and the fading awareness of the original builders. He could feel their presence, millions of underwater beings who had made the same choice he was making, their individual identities long since dissolved into the collective purpose of maintaining the prison. But unlike the original Guardians, Paul retained enough of his human perspective to understand what humanity would face if he failed. Through the prison sensors, he watched Mike pilot the Deep Hunter to safety, carrying Becca away from the nightmare they had accidentally disturbed. He felt a distant sadness as he watched his friends disappear into the darkness above, knowing he would never see them again, in any form they would recognize. But that sadness was already being absorbed into the larger emotional matrix of his new existence, becoming part of the complex web of motivations that would drive him to maintain his vigil. The entity raged against its renewed imprisonment, throwing itself against the barriers with a fury that shook the entire structure. But the barriers held, reinforced by Paul's willing sacrifice and powered by his expanding consciousness. The creature gradually settled back into the deepest chambers, its hunger temporarily satisfied by the knowledge that it had a new guardian to observe and potentially corrupt. But Paul understood something the entity didn't fully grasp. The prison operated on principles that went beyond simple containment. It was a complex system that required delicate balance between punishment and reward, fear and hope. The creature needed to be fed just enough to keep it docile, without allowing it to grow stronger. This was why the Bermuda Triangle had claimed victims over the decades, but not randomly. The previous Guardian had been carefully selecting targets, people whose disappearance served the greater good of keeping the entity contained. Ships carrying criminals fleeing justice, aircraft filled with weapons dealers and human traffickers, vessels whose passengers had chosen to place themselves beyond the protection of normal society. Each lost soul became part of the entity's consciousness, experiencing the eternal torment that was the price of keeping it imprisoned. But their sacrifice prevented something far worse: the consumption of billions of innocent minds and the eventual spread of the entity's influence across the galaxy. Paul began to understand the full scope of his new responsibilities. He wasn't just a guard, but a judge, tasked with making impossible decisions about who would live and who would become part of the creature's consciousness. The role required not just vigilance, but wisdom, the ability to weigh individual lives against the survival of entire species. The structure itself began to change around him, adapting to his human perspective and technological understanding. The ancient systems integrated with his memories of modern science, creating new capabilities that the original builders had never envisioned. Paul found he could monitor human activity across the globe, tracking potential threats and opportunities with unprecedented precision. But he also discovered that his connection to the entity was more complex than simple opposition. Part of maintaining the prison involved understanding the creature's psychology, predicting its attempts at escape and manipulation. Over time, Paul realized he would inevitably absorb some of its alien perspective, becoming something that was neither fully human nor entirely other. Months passed in the world above, marked by changes that only Paul could fully perceive. Becca and Mike surfaced to find their research vessel surrounded by ships from government agencies that officially didn't exist. Their reports were immediately classified at levels that transcended normal security protocols, their research confiscated by people who seemed to have been expecting exactly this kind of discovery. The two survivors were debriefed using techniques that went far beyond conventional interrogation. Their memories were carefully edited, not destroyed but selectively suppressed, leaving them with the knowledge that something terrible waited in the depths, but unable to recall the specific details that might lead others to the same discovery. Becca found herself reassigned to a research position studying ocean thermal layers in the Pacific, her expertise in marine geology redirected toward projects that would keep her far from the Atlantic. Mike was offered early retirement with benefits so generous that refusing would have been financially impossible. His deep-sea piloting career effectively ended by a medical review that found conditions that had never existed before. But the psychological conditioning wasn't perfect. Becca sometimes woke from dreams filled with Paul's voice, echoing from depths that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. She would find herself drawing symbols she didn't recognize, writing fragments of conversations in languages she had never learned, her unconscious mind trying to process experiences that her conscious awareness had been programmed to forget. Mike experienced similar symptoms, finding himself avoiding certain areas of the ocean without being able to explain why. He would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of deep water in his mouth and the sound of alien voices in his ears, his body responding to memories that his mind couldn't access. Neither of them tried to contact the other, though both felt the impulse. The conditioning had included psychological barriers that made it difficult to discuss their shared experience, even between themselves. They lived with the weight of half-remembered trauma, carrying the burden of knowledge they couldn't fully recall or effectively communicate. The Bermuda Triangle continued to function as it always had, claiming victims when the prison needed reinforcement. But now the selections were guided by Paul's human understanding of justice and necessity. He chose targets more carefully than the previous Guardian had been able to, using his knowledge of human society to identify people whose disappearance would serve the greater good. A yacht carrying arms dealers, heading for a conflict zone, simply vanished during a storm that appeared from nowhere. A private jet transporting human traffickers encountered impossible weather conditions and was never seen again. A research vessel filled with scientists working on biological weapons experienced equipment failures that led them into the Triangle's influence. Each loss was carefully calculated, designed to remove threats to human society while providing the entity with the consciousness it needed to remain docile. Paul felt the weight of each decision, knowing that every person he guided to the prison would experience eternal torment as part of the creature's mental matrix, but he also felt the satisfaction of preventing greater tragedies. The arms dealers would have supplied weapons that killed thousands. The human traffickers would have destroyed hundreds of lives. The weapons researchers would have created diseases that could have ended human civilization. In the crushing depths, Paul Bennett maintained his eternal vigil, his consciousness distributed throughout the crystalline networks that powered the ancient prison. He was no longer fully human, but he retained enough of his original self to understand the moral complexity of his role. Every soul he fed to the creature was a piece of his own humanity, sacrificed to keep a greater evil contained. But each sacrifice also prevented something far worse: the consumption of billions of innocent minds and the eventual transformation of Earth into another feeding ground for the cosmic horror trapped below. Paul had become more than a guardian. He was a living barrier between the world above and the ultimate darkness that dwelt in the deepest places of reality. He could feel the entity's eternal patience, its vast intelligence constantly working at the barriers that contained it, waiting for any sign of weakness or opportunity. But Paul also felt something the creature couldn't understand or defeat, the human capacity for sacrifice and love that had led him to accept this role. That willing choice to protect others at the cost of his own humanity created a kind of spiritual barrier that the entity, for all its power and intelligence, couldn't fully comprehend or overcome. The prison would hold as long as Paul maintained his vigil, and Paul would maintain his vigil as long as there were innocent lives to protect. In the cold darkness of the ocean floor, surrounded by the whispers of the damned, but sustained by the knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning, he kept watch over humanity's greatest secret. And in the deepest chambers of the structure, the entity stirred and plotted, dreaming of the day when it would finally break free to begin its harvest of human consciousness. But that day would not come while Paul Bennett stood guard, no longer quite human, but not yet something else entirely, maintaining his impossible vigil in the depths beneath the Bermuda Triangle. The story of Dr. Paul Bennett and his team had become legend among the classified circles that monitored such things, a cautionary tale about the price of curiosity and the sacrifices necessary to protect humanity from threats it couldn't imagine. But for Paul himself, trapped in eternal guardianship over a cosmic horror, the story was far from over. Each day brought new challenges, new attempts by the entity to escape or corrupt his purpose. Each night brought dreams filled with the voices of his victims, their eternal suffering a constant reminder of the terrible responsibility he had accepted. And each moment brought the knowledge that somewhere above, the world continued to turn, protected by his sacrifice from a darkness it would never know existed. In the depths of the Bermuda Triangle, where reality operated by rules that human science had never discovered, Paul Bennett kept his vigil and waited for the day when someone else would be brave enough and compassionate enough to take his place in the eternal guard duty that protected all conscious life from the hunger that dwelt in the spaces between dimensions.